Hello everyone and welcome. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in the stories. I am Aida. I was born into a family in the lower part of the city, where the level of education and financial situation were low. Besides myself, I had 3 older sisters, one of whom got married early. But when I became aware of things and started school, I felt that I deserved a life better than that. I knew I couldn't reach what I wanted quickly, so when I entered school, I tried to focus on my studies, hoping that it might eventually help me get a job, escape that harsh reality, and improve my life. By the time I reached middle school, one of my sisters was forced by my father to marry a man about 15 years older. That day, I realized that no girl in our family had a future, and I concluded that no matter how hard I tried at home, I wouldn't be able to find an escape for myself. I felt certain that, like my other 2 sisters, I would end up forced into an early marriage. Still, I couldn't accept that in my heart. It wasn't something I could easily accept or resign myself to. Even as a child, I would sit beside my sister and tell her that the best thing she could do would be to run away from the marriage ceremony and build a life for herself. But my sister was afraid. She said that kind of thing only happens in movies. And in real life, you sometimes have to accept the choices others make for you just to keep going. But I couldn't accept that my life would be lived according to others' desires. I was always an ambitious girl and didn't want some man to come along and make decisions for me, as had happened with my sisters. When I grew up and reached high school, I made a series of decisions for myself that, at the time, seemed like the best way to save my life. When I finished school, I had saved some money, and I planned to run away with that money and a bit of jewelry that I secretly took from my mother. One night, when everyone was asleep, I took the jewelry, left home, and spent the night in a small inn. The next day, I knew I had to quickly find a job to support myself because I didn't want to run out of that money too soon. The next day, I started searching for work, though it wasn't easy to find something suitable. Finally, I went to a beauty salon where the manager, an older woman who took good care of herself, agreed to hire me. She told me that I wouldn't get paid the first month, but promised a decent salary from the following month. She even said that if she saw how hardworking I was, she'd give me a commission for each customer I helped. So, I stayed there and started working from the first day. When my boss, Rana, realized I was staying at an inn, she offered me a place near the salon, saying it would be better for me. I accepted, as this way, I wouldn't have to spend my earnings on the inn. Rana treated me kindly. In fact, there were 5 of us girls working there, and she treated us all as her daughters. Interestingly, the other girls had also run away from home like me. After a month, Rana kept her promise and paid me commissions for the customers I served. From the next month, my official work began, and I had become accustomed to the environment. I was glad about my decision not to stay at home, where I would have been forced into marriage and left heartbroken. One day, Rana made me a proposal. She said that if I always followed her rules and listened to her instructions, I could make even more money. Eager to improve my financial situation and maybe one day build an ideal life for myself, I listened intently, waiting for her to explain what I needed to do to earn more. Rana told me that all the girls who worked there had accepted her offer and were now earning nearly 3 times the regular salary. Finally, Rana explained that she knew men who came to us for various reasons, and the girls received a good amount of money for each night they spent with these men. At first, I was upset by Rana's suggestion, and I pushed back, telling her I wasn't that kind of girl. But Rana told me I could try it just once, and if I didn't like the money, I could go back to my regular work in the salon with a modest salary. I listened to her and decided to go to the address she gave me that night. She had put a dress in my bag, instructing me to wear it for the evening. When I arrived at the address, it was a large villa. A man, an older gentleman, opened the door. Despite his age, he was charming. He introduced himself as Homayun and invited me inside. From the beginning, he complimented my beauty and told me he was mesmerized by my eyes. Following Rana's instructions, I put on the dress she had given me, and Homayun approached me. For my first experience, I was incredibly nervous, but Homayun reassured me, saying he wouldn't do anything that would cause me to lose my virtue, and that he was mindful of everything. I found it strange that he was so considerate, which helped me relax and trust him. I allowed him to get closer. That night was my first encounter with a man, and surprisingly, I found it enjoyable. When we were finished, he handed me an envelope of money, and I took a cab he had arranged back home. When I entered the house, I saw Rana sitting there. After she greeted me, she asked about the night and then snatched the envelope from my hand, taking some of the money for herself and leaving the rest for me. Then she asked about the man, and I started describing him, telling her I hadn't expected the men who came to her to be so respectful. Finally, Rana asked if I wanted to continue this work. Since I had liked Homayun and had enjoyed myself, and the money was good, I eagerly agreed to keep doing it. That night, Rana told me that I should do this work 5 nights a week, and I agreed. She added that Wednesday nights would always be reserved for Homayun. After that, I started seeing different men, but I always looked forward to Wednesday nights. One day, I met a young man, much younger than the others. He introduced himself as Seper. Unlike the other men who usually got straight to business, he offered me a drink. I wasn't much into that, but Rana had told me beforehand that I had to meet all the clients' expectations. Otherwise, they wouldn't pay us anything. So I drank a little, but not enough to lose my clarity. Then Seper approached me, and feeling anxious, I asked him to respect my boundaries. Seper, however, laughed and said that didn't matter to him. He laughed again, saying a girl who came to such a place shouldn't care about virtue or her future. He also warned that if I caused trouble, he'd simply take back the money he'd planned to give me and ask Rana for it back. I had no choice at that point but to accept his demands. Seper came closer, and unlike all my previous experiences, I was in tears that night, regretting my choices. But it was too late. After Seper handed me the money, I felt an intense urge to escape from that house. When I got home, Rana was there as usual. Seeing my condition, she asked what was wrong, and when I explained, she laughed, asking if nothing like that had happened to me before. When I said it hadn't, Rana laughed again and said, "So, until now, all those men really must have liked you." She added that Seper had simply done his job right. Then she repeated his words, saying, "A girl who starts this kind of work should know the consequences." And, as always, Rana took her share of the money and left. After that, it seemed like I'd gotten used to the work. I no longer cared what people thought of me or how they saw me. Even though I was young because of my job, I had started to look like a fully grown woman. Often, if I saw a handsome man, I couldn't hold myself back and would make the first move. When I chose and brought clients myself, Rana didn't take a share, and I got to keep all the money. This made me more motivated, and I wasn't the old Raha anymore. I didn't care about my reputation or my future. Money had become my only focus. I was earning a lot, all by selling myself. I wasn't even regretful, and told myself that even if I only had a few years left to live, at least I would live the way I deserved, not in poverty. I convinced myself that if I had stayed with my family, it wouldn't have made any difference. The only difference would have been that any money would go to my family, and I'd end up married to some old man. At least this way, I was enjoying my youth, and all those men, especially Humayun, took care of me and showed me love. It was appealing, knowing that even though they knew what I did, they still treated me kindly. After about a year, this had become my routine. I'd changed so much, seeing everything through the lens of money. Humayun, knowing everything about me, even offered to make me happy if I left this work. But I just laughed it off, as I'd grown accustomed to this life. And even Humayun himself was a man who saw other women, not just me. Then one day, I went out without my wallet, leaving it at Rana's place by accident. I took a taxi, and when it was time to pay, I realized I didn't have any money. There were no other passengers in the car, and I noticed the driver was a good-looking man. Without thinking, I adjusted my posture, using body language to suggest I could repay him in a different way. But surprisingly, the driver angrily rebuked me, took me toward the police station. We hadn't yet reached the station when a man stepped forward, asking the driver to let go of me and stop the swearing. The driver, who was rather rude, explained everything that had happened. The man, seeming like a trustworthy person, told the driver to leave me there, assuring him he'd handle the situation. Trusting him, the driver left after a final insult. I was deeply upset by what had happened, and once the driver left, I couldn't hold back my tears. I begged the man not to take me to the station because I knew no one would come to help me. Rana had warned me never to get into this kind of trouble, and if I ended up at the police station, she wouldn't get involved. The man calmly led me to his car without coming too close and asked me to sit inside. He drove me to a park, and while I continued to cry, he tried to calm me down. He introduced himself as Mustafa and asked me to listen to him without judgment. Mustafa explained that he wanted a month with me to help me leave this path. But I was so disillusioned with life that I kept telling him loudly that I had no choice and that my life was already ruined. Mustafa, with his calm demeanor, continued to try to reassure me. He asked me to go to Rana and tell her I wouldn't be coming back to that work. I resisted, saying that if I lost this job, I wouldn't be able to find anything else that paid as well. Still, Mustafa promised he would pay me the same amount in exchange for working for him. At first, I thought Mustafa was going to propose something like Rana's offer, but he explained he organized Quran recitations for people and offered prayers for those who had passed away. If I took on this work, he promised I'd earn the same, or even more, than what I was making before. I told him I didn't know how to do this kind of work, but he assured me he had someone who could teach me. That day, he gave me his contact information and asked me to speak with Rana that night. However, he told me not to mention him. When I told Rana I wanted to return to my family and leave this work, she didn't resist, but she insisted I give her half of everything I'd earned so far. I was furious, arguing that just because I was leaving didn't give her the right to take my money. Rana said that was how it worked, and if I didn't agree, she'd report me to the police. That night, she took the keys to her place from me, and I spent the night at a guest house. I called Mustafa, even argued with him, but he promised to give me the amount to pay Rana. The next day, he met me at the guest house with the money, then took me to see Rana. She took the money and threw me out, not even giving me what little I had left there. Afterward, Mustafa took me to a mosque, where he arranged for me to stay in a small room above it, rent-free. At first, I was guarded and suspicious of Mustafa. I didn't like how he maintained boundaries and didn't even glance at me, but I reminded myself I was getting paid and didn't need to worry about him. For a month, I spent my time reading Quran and offering prayers for others. One night, Mustafa told me an elderly woman without children had passed away and I needed to pray for her. I accepted, and while reciting prayers, I came across a verse that moved me deeply. It seemed to speak directly to the life I'd been leading. For a moment, I felt as if my entire being was filled with regret. That night, I couldn't stop crying and finally fell asleep from exhaustion. The next morning, I informed Mustafa that I'd completed the prayers, and he came to the mosque to pay me, but I refused the money, saying I wanted to dedicate those prayers to the elderly woman's soul. Over time, the mosque became my home. I took on the responsibility of caring for it and even came to love cleaning the courtyard. When Mustafa came by to give me my monthly earnings one day, I invited him inside the small apartment he had arranged for me. I dressed modestly for the first time, and he noticed the change. Though we hadn't talked much before, that day I thanked him for being like an angel who had crossed my path and helped me become a new person. Mustafa told me he had only done his duty as a human being. It was my choice to change and find the right path. He mentioned that I was the third person he'd met in my line of work, but the first to take his advice and walk the path he'd opened. From that day, I started praying regularly for myself as well, and even pursued creative work to earn a little extra income. I didn't want to leave the mosque, even when my financial situation improved. Mustafa never suggested I should move out either. After nearly a year there, I told Mustafa that since my life had changed for the better, maybe it was time for that room to go to someone else in need. He was hesitant, but eventually agreed. We began searching for a place, but it was challenging to find a landlord willing to rent to a single woman. Finally, Mustafa suggested that after years of being away, it might be best to return to my family and let go of the past. Although I had mixed feelings, I was deeply homesick, so Mustafa took me back to my old neighborhood. My father was standing outside as always, and when he saw me, he yelled for my mother, overwhelmed with excitement and surprise. When my mother saw me, her tears flowed, and she apologized for everything that had happened, blaming herself for the way things had turned out. She told me that both my sisters, who had married, had since divorced, and that she now believed I was the only one of her daughters who was truly happy. My sisters, too, admired my courage. They told me they hadn't dared to change their lives like I had, instead accepting their fates. From that day on, I kept in touch with my family, but I continued working with Mustafa and didn't want to move in with them. Then, one day, Mustafa, stumbling over his words, confessed that he'd been drawn to me from the start. When he looked into my eyes, he said he knew I wasn't truly a bad person and felt a desire to help me regain the innocence that had once been there. Blushing, he finally expressed his feelings and told me he wants someone like me as his wife. At first, I thought he was only saying this out of pity, so I reminded him of my past and warned him that I didn't think I'd make a good wife for him. But Mustafa replied that he'd already made up his mind a long time ago and wanted to formally propose. When I saw his determination, I felt as though all these events had unfolded just so that I could meet someone like him. I realized that everything Mustafa had done for me over the past year had been out of a genuine love, the kind of love I'd never known before. So I accepted his proposal. A few days later, Mustafa came to my family's house with his mother and his sister. His father had passed away when he was young, and despite knowing all about my family's past struggles, Mustafa treated them with respect. After everything, we had a simple wedding without any elaborate ceremony, and from that day, I felt my happiness was complete with Mustafa by my side. It was as if God had finally opened the doors of joy to me after I'd spent so long knocking on them. A year later, we decided to have a child, and 9 months later, I held a healthy baby boy in my arms. We named him Mikhail. He's 6 now, and all these years with Mustafa have brought me peace. With my creative work, we were able to save up, buy our own home, and use the small apartment above the mosque for charity, helping young couples who married for love but were struggling financially. Several years have now passed since those difficult days, and every day I'm more grateful for the choices I made. I never saw Rana again. It felt like that period of my life had been a test I had failed at first, but God, in His mercy, gave me another chance to change. The final opportunity came when Mustafa entered my life, and by accepting him as my angel, I was able to turn away from my past mistakes. Whenever I face hardships now, I go to the same mosque where I first found my way again. Nearly every month, I offer prayers for the soul of that elderly woman, in gratitude for the transformation she unknowingly brought to my life. I've learned that we shouldn't overlook life's events, as sometimes God reveals Himself through the people around us.